Chapter 12, Advanced Drawing Setup. Hi, Joe Cerrone, Kid 116. Today we're going to look at the textbook readings for basic AutoCAD called Advanced Drawing Setup. And in this chapter, we'll look at drawing settings, things like the limits, scale factors, templates, and those considerations for creating those templates. So the basic concept is that before you start drawing, you have these standards that you'll use, and the standards would be things like units, limits, layers, line types, line weights, and colors. And so when you look at a mechanical drawing or an architectural drawing, we'll have these different standard line weights and line types set for you. So in our architectural title block, we'll have a layer for dimension, and we'll have layers for furniture as well as for viewports. And then in our mechanical drawing, we'll have layers for dimensions, center line, hidden lines, dotted lines, instructions, text. And so those are components that we look at in setting up a drawing. We'll have different units that are used within those templates. And so, for example, if we come over to the D2L section for all the title blocks, we have these different title blocks for you. And so here's our mechanical template. If we download that and open it, we can then take a look at things like the format for the units. And the units are set for decimal on this drawing template, versus if we download the template for the architecture and we open that file, here's our architectural title block. And then if we were to look at our units here, we'll see that we have the architectural units of measurements dialed in. And so as we work with these different templates, we already have set up a number of these factors for you. But if you wanted to do this from scratch, this chapter walks you through that. So you would start off by opening up just a generic template, setting the units, the limits, the snap, the grid. LT scale we'll talk about here, where it's a factor, and you really don't need to worry about it so much on the mechanical prints as you do on the architectural prints, because the spacing between the lines changes. And so we demonstrated that in last chapter, but essentially we set that up to the inverse of the plot scale. And then layers, text styles, dimension styles in the layout tab. And so what they do here is they start off by saying, all right, let's start a new drawing. And so you would basically come over here and say File, New. And if we're just taking an AutoCAD template, that's the default. You'd take this AutoCAD template, and then you could go here and you could say Format Units. And then depending on what type of units we would want to set up, we can go and take a look at what they're talking about here. And they don't tell us what units to use. They're just saying use the units. And so if we left them at decimal, we could say OK. And then when they say limits, what they're talking about is the workable area for the drawing. And so let's say we were going to put this on a B-size mechanical print. We could say 17, 11. 17 units in the x-axis, 11 units in the y-axis. And actually, let me escape that. Let me say limits again. Lower left, you always want to be 0, 0. It just makes the calculations easier. Upper right, 17, 11, enter. And then you might say, well, there's nothing changed. Well, there's something called grid display. And if you change the grid display from a 0 or whatever it's at to a 2, then the grid display will be within the limits. And that's what we do on our architectural title block. If I were to go and turn on Snap and Grid under Drafting Settings, by enabling them, I have a 1/2 inch snap and a 1/2 inch grid. I can OK that, and then you can see that if I were in a draw commands, now I'm snapping to the grid units. All right, so as we look at these settings for setting up a drawing. We have the units, the limits, and then after you perform a limits change, they recommend a zoom all. And so that's so that you can see everything after you have increased the size if there's something off the screen. And then you have the snap and the snap spacing. I think we've covered that quite well. And then this LT scale and PSLT scale and things like that are essentially line type scaling. And so when we look at a drawing like this, in the model space, if I go to a top view, and if I were to draw a line on the hidden line layer, the factor that sets the spacing between the line types is called LT scale. And so LT scale on most mechanicals is 1. It's actually the inverse of the plot scale. So if we had a half scale set up, we would have it then at 2. And what you'll notice is that the scaling increases as the values increase. And that's so when we scale something in a viewport, it looks appropriate. We go through that more in the 117 class as we start to standardize our technical drawings. A couple other things that they talk about in this chapter are text styles and dimension styles. And so we have set those up for you as well. And so if we go into our template and we were to look at the Annotate tab, on the Annotate tab, you can look at what's called a text style. And it's just like a word processor, where you have all these different fonts that you could use, and then once you've chosen the font that you want to use, so for example on the mechanical title block we have the standard is Verdana, and you don't set a text height in the text style when you use them for dimensions, and so that's why the height isn't given, but you can set them up. So like just on a word processor, when you use the different style, like maybe headline or paragraph, then the text would be displayed appropriately. And then there's other things like effects that you can have where you can have the text that's put in upside down or backwards. And this would be for somebody who's maybe a sign maker and who's printing things like a sticker for your windshield for your car, where you'd stick it to the windshield and you would have that possibly backwards reading so that when the sticker is looked at from the opposite side, it's right reading. And so they do a lot of work with these different fonts, and depending on the font style that you use, you'll have these what they call true type fonts, and then the original AutoCAD ones have these little compasses on them. And so when you look at the other fonts like this TXT font, this would be the original AutoCAD font, and it's very plain. And so if I looked at that, the text font for that is super plain. I'm going to cancel out of that. And so that's what text fonts are and how they look, and then you can invoke those and use those in many different ways. And I think I've got something on the AutoCAD website. And so if I go into my AutoCAD, let me just pull it up on my other screen. And then if we were to look at so here's a website I developed, AutoCAD.com, and we've migrated over to D2L, but in module 4 of this I have some information on working with text fonts. And so if you're interested in getting more information about it, here's my information on text fonts. And it's kind of neat because you can have all these different text fonts and text styles. And so I used to work at a vocational center, and here's one of the drawings that is really good for demonstrating all the different things that you can do with text. And so things like, here's our really plain text, but you can place it very accurately. You can have these different fonts. You can set up these angles, justifications, text that will fit between 2 points, and then things like overscoring, underscoring, everything you can do on a word processor vertical text, as well as, precision alignment of text using things like O-snaps and things like that. So some of the information in the AutoCAD is there for your reference if you'd like to use it, but it's not required. It's just another source of information for you. And so as we work with things like dimension styles, it's sort of the same thing where you have the ability to go through and set up a dimension style on a CAD drawing. And so if we were to look at a dimension style on one of our blueprints, we would go to the Annotate tab, and in the dimension area there's something called a Style Manager. And if you hover over those corner arrows, it'll give you a little bit more information. But essentially it's like a template that you can then set up to have different fonts. And so this will pull the standard font from the text setting, which is our basic Verdana. You can have the text colors to be different. You can then have the fill colors to be different. There's all kinds of things you can change around with them, but we don't really do a lot with them. We give them to you already set up. The primary units is probably the most important thing as you go through and you dimension. If we have it set up for 2-dimensional precision points of accuracy versus something like 3 dimensions of accuracy, or something like going on the space shuttle, we could say 5 decimal points of precision, and this makes this very expensive to make, or very high tolerances is what they call it. And so those are controlled within the dimension styles, and you can adjust those as the textbook talks about, and the end of the chapter gives you information on how to do that. And so as we look at our textbook readings, these are basic settings that we use within a drawing. And then lastly, they talk about the Layout tab. And so the way the Layout tab works here is that we have these mechanical drawings, and then here's our tab for paper space. And in paper space, or layout mode, what it does is it puts the paper on for us. So this is like a preview of what the plotted sheet would look like on paper. And then there's what's called a viewport, and then the viewport is scaled for the object to fit within that. Same with the architectural drawings. And so if we were on an architectural drawing, here's our viewport tab, or our layout tab. We're in paper space, and then if we double click in the viewport, we can see that this viewport is set at 1/4 of an inch equals a foot. And that's where we get into all these different settings for scaling, which we've pretty well set up for you already by using the templates. In the intermediate AutoCAD course, we go through a lot of the drafting standards and how those are set up for technical drawings and architectural versus mechanical. So if you take the second course, we'll go into these in more detail. Alrighty, and so as we look at the chapter also talks about then same thing, setting the limits, being able to change the size of the limits and the scale factors for consideration. Those things are pretty well set up as we have the drawing templates. Setting the snap, you can just adjust it. If you don't want it to be a 1/2 inch, you can set it to 1/4 inch or an 1/8 inch. Grid, LT scale, MSLT scale, and PSLT scale are all factors within the viewport. So when we change these scale factors, oftentimes we have to adjust the scale settings to get them within standards. Line types, line weights, and colors are property managers of the layer properties. And then we talk briefly about different text styles and dimension styles that we can apply to our drawings. And essentially then they're talking about being able to activate or work within a viewport and a title block. And then they talk about using templates, which is exactly what we're using. And so we have these template drawings, and so in D2L we have it here as all templates that you can download and use. And in our textbook they talk about the templates for when you start a new drawing, and so they give you excruciating detail of how these are set up. And so here's your AutoCAD template, the AutoCAD.dwt, and how those settings are set within it. But if we were to look at that and we were in AutoCAD and we said new, it goes to the template folder and has what's available for you. And the ones that come with AutoCAD are the ones that say AutoCAD and this other one like Tutorial I. That would be imperial, meaning the units of measurement would be inches, versus Tutorial I, which is also in inches, versus Tutorial M, which would be millimeters or metric. And so these different templates have certain settings that were set for you. But like we said, we've already got some of them set up for you, like this B-size mechanical. I put this one in the template so that when we work with it, the units is already set for you. And then the layers and line types and other aspects are also set for you as well. So as we go through and we work with these templates, we want to just be able to understand how they're created and how they're made. DWT is the file extension. There's other file extensions that we can use as we get better with AutoCAD. And then it goes through some other things like advanced settings for annotative objects, which we go through in the intermediate course. And essentially what that does is it automatically adjusts the sizing of your text settings. It's a little bit complicated, and so we just talk about it in the first class. Chapter exercises here are to go through and just create a template with different layers. You don't necessarily need to do that. We have a drawing assignment in the module 5 that is basically set up to create these different mechanical or architectural drawings. And so in our module for this, we'll create this architectural drawing with all the components as shown here. Alrighty, that ends this textbook lecture. Chapter 12.